welcome to LAC Flying School. My name is Christopher Van and this is the second video in our pre-flight briefings. This is Effects for Controls Part 2. The aim is to maintain a datum attitude whilst operating the engine and flap controls. Why we do this? Because we need to learn how to operate the aircraft systems in flight and also while we are flying the aircraft. Our threat and error management, again, other airplanes. Errors we can make, engine mishandling, because we're going to be operating the engine controls, and overstress damaging the flaps. So the way we can manage these is by keeping a good lookout again, at all times, monitoring the temperature and pressure gauges in the cockpit, and also being aware of the flap limitations, which is going to tell us how to operate the flaps correctly. So our exercise, initially we'll start off by doing the external checks and then the internal checks. Start the engine, taxi out to the runway, and once we're airborne we'll have a revision, just looking at trimming again and selecting an attitude. The way to select an attitude, we always want to roll the aircraft first, then pitch, then check the ball, and we can also use a mantra, select, hold, trim for our trimming. So that will be more later in the flight, but again it's one of those keywords we can start to use is select, hold, trim. After that we'll start by using the throttle, and we just want a nice gentle movement whenever we use the throttle. At the top end is our dead bands. At the very top you're not going to see much RPM change. The majority of the change happens in the lower 3/4 in our live band. Now depending on the aircraft you fly, the throttle on a PA-28 is an up and down movement, the Cessna is an in-out, but they have exactly the same effects. So moving the throttle down or out, it will decrease the RPM and it will make the noise quieter. When you increase the throttle, the RPM will increase and we'll see the noise will get louder. After that we'll see what effect the power has. As we increase the power we get a pitch up and a yaw to the left. As we decrease the power by bringing the throttle out or down, we'll get a pitch down and a yaw to the right. Now on both of these, we want to try and use throttle by sound and feel. You don't want to be looking at the RPM gauge or looking inside the cockpit whilst we're flying, whilst we're operating the aircraft systems. So the way we're going to use this is start to use another acronym of PAT. This stands for power, setting by sound and feel, holding the attitude, because we want to maintain the datum attitude by using the elevator and the rudder, and finally we can trim the aircraft out to make our life easier. So try to use PAT when we think about the power change. After that we'll have a look at using the mixture, and it will find it as a red control in the cockpit compared to the throttle, which is a black. So they try and make it so when they design the aircraft they thought about how they can make this control different in colour and also by shape. At the top of the mixture, or in for the Cessnas, the mixture is fully rich, and it's commonly used for any takeoff or climbs. Down at the bottom is what we call the idle cutoff. This is primarily used for when we want to stop the engine. The mixture, as I'm sure you're reading, controls the amount of fuel going into the engine for most efficient flying, if it is appropriate for our phase of flight. but fully forward or up is rich, down the bottom is idle cut off. After that, we'll look at carburetor heating. Now, the heating, it prevents carburetor icing, and it's ice forming around the carburetors. At the top, for PA28, is off or cold. If you move it down to the bottom, it will be hot or on. Again, for the Cessnas, it will be in for cold, out for hot. Now, when we use the carburetor heating, you will see an RPM drop, an RPM decrease. This shows us no ice in the engine. If when we brought it out we saw a RPM rise, that would indicate ice has been formed. It'd be normal for the engine to run rough for a few seconds while that engine melts, and then we can recheck. Next stage are flaps, and one of our threats, as we said, was damaging the flaps. So we have a limitation, and this is called a VFE. It'll be the maximum speed at which we can operate the flaps. Inside the cockpit on our airspeed indicator we have a white arc. The top of that white arc is the VFE. In other words, we must always be inside the white arc while we operate the flaps. Now when we do operate the flaps, lowering and raising them will give a pitch and resultantly an attitude change. So the first thing we always check is that limitation. Are we slow enough? Check the airspeed. Then we'll operate by selecting the flap. Looking outside while we do this, holding the attitude, and if need be, trimming any forces off. Lastly, once the aircraft settled back down, we can do a visual check and indication. Depending on the aircraft you fly, more specifically the 150s for example, the indicator is above your head. So you just need to have a double check of that indication once the flaps are deployed. So mnemonic for this one, for the flaps, can be limitation, operation, indication. And up on the board there can be different degrees of flap. It just depends on the aircraft you're flying. They can come in different stages, which you will learn as you go through your aircraft systems. Our last one on the board here is cabin heating and ventilation controls, to make our life a bit nicer. On a PA28 it is a sliding scale. It has a heat and a demist functions. At the top will be our heating, and it's just a slide it on for the heating on. Again for the demist, again it's just a slide. For the Cessnas, again it's, as you can start to see from in the cockpit, they're all in and out controls. Now with all of these, we must make sure that when we operate the controls, we find we are looking outside at our attitude. A common error we see is that people are looking inside the cockpit, moving the control lever, and then find the nose of the aircraft goes in different directions. So we always try and look outside while we operate the engine and flap controls. So that ends the Effects Controls 2 briefing. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.